12 brutal hours on the job, hands black with grease, boots crusted in sawdust, back screaming since Monday. I drag home, turn into the driveway, and stop dead. A shiny silver Lexus parked dead center in my workshop. Engine cold. No note. No driver. Worse, my gate lock swapped. With hers. On my property. The driveway I graveled myself. HOA Karen, the clipboard tyrant with county connections, claimed my space like it was hers. Fined me twice for messy tools. Now this. I could have yelled, towed it, called cops. Instead, I stayed ice cold, grabbed my welder, fired it up. Sparks flew like crazy. Then I booked a flight to Hawaii. What happened to her precious Lexus? And why did I vanish for 10 days of beaches and zero drama? You'll never guess how it ended. What would you do? Weld it shut? Or something worse? Drop your take below. And where are you watching from? Texas? Cali? HOA hell. Let me back up and paint you a picture of Harrowfield Estates, because you need to understand the terrain before you understand the war. Harrowfield Estates sits about 40 minutes outside of Columbus, Ohio, one of those planned developments from the early 2000s, where all the houses have the same 3 shades of vinyl siding and the same sad little maples in the front yard that never quite grew into real trees. The streets have names like Cobblestone Crossing and Heritage Run, which is deeply ironic because there's nothing cobbled and nothing historic about any of it. But the lots are generous, the property taxes are reasonable, and when my wife Darlene and I bought our place back in 2009, it felt like we'd finally made it. I'm Garrett Pruitt. I'm 53 years old. I spent 22 years as a union pipe fitter before a knee injury slowed me down enough that I transitioned into running my own mobile welding and fabrication business out of a detached workshop on my property. The workshop is a 1,400 square foot steel frame structure I designed and built myself, with help from my father, Dale Pruitt, who spent 40 years as a union ironworker before his heart gave out in the winter of 2019. Every beam in that building has a story. The concrete floor still has a dent where Dad dropped a come-along chain one July afternoon, and we both laughed until we cried. That building is not a shed. It is not a garage. It is a place of work and memory, and it is legally classified as an accessory structure on a commercial use lot, a detail that will matter enormously later. The workshop sits behind our house, accessed by a private gravel drive that runs along the south side of the property. We have a gate at the road. The gate has a lock. We gave the code to exactly 3 people: Darlene, our neighbor Bud Federolf, and my business partner, Clyde Harshaw. The gate was, theoretically, secure. Enter Beverly Drummond. Beverly moved into Harrowfield Estates in the spring of 2021, purchasing the largest corner lot on the street, a fact she mentioned within approximately 45 seconds of introducing herself at the neighborhood 4th of July gathering that year. She was dressed for a garden party in what Darlene described as a linen blazer that had never met a wrinkle, and she spent most of the cookout making small, precise comments about the height of other people's hedges. Beverly was a retired insurance executive turned full-time HOA enthusiast. Within 6 months, she'd gotten herself elected HOA president through a combination of relentless campaigning and the general apathy of everyone else on the board. She sent her first violation notice to a neighbor for having a basketball hoop visible from the street. Her second notice went to an elderly widow named Gloria Tews for parking her adult son's pickup in her own driveway, in excess of 72 consecutive hours, a rule that, prior to Beverly's tenure, nobody had enforced in 15 years. The air at Harrowfield always had that mild suburban smell: cut grass, charcoal smoke, the faint chemical bite of someone's lawn treatment drifting on the breeze. After Beverly arrived, there was a new undertone to it, something tighter, something that smelled, faintly, like fear. The first time Beverly came after me, it was over a propane tank stored legally on my property, within code, behind a fence, in a manner consistent with the way I'd been storing it for 9 years. She photographed it through a gap in my fence and filed a formal complaint. I responded with the county permit, the state code citation, and a 3-paragraph letter from my attorney. She backed off. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. The thing about people like Beverly Drummond is that they don't actually want to win any specific fight. They want to win the war of your attention. They want you tired. They want you reactive. And the moment you stop paying attention, that's when they make their move. Mine came on a Thursday in March, when I pulled up my gravel drive after a long day cutting pipe flanges for a municipal water project, and found that silver Lexus sitting in the middle of my workshop floor like it had always lived there. The gate code had been changed, the lock had been replaced, and taped to my workshop door, was a printout of an HOA resolution declaring my private drive a community access easement. I read it twice. Then I called Clyde. Then I called my attorney, a sharp-minded woman named Rosalind Fitch. And then I went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and started making a list. Let me tell you about that HOA resolution, because it was either the most audacious piece of paper I'd ever seen in my life, or I was losing my mind. And I've been tested for that, so I ruled it out. The document Beverly had taped to my door was a community access and easement resolution, dated 2 weeks prior, bearing the signatures of herself as president, her next-door neighbor Clifford Ainsley as treasurer, a retired insurance adjuster who'd co-signed every one of her schemes, and a third board member named Tamsin Voyle, who later told me under oath she'd signed the document, believing it was an amendment to the landscaping guidelines. The resolution claimed that the gravel drive running along the south side of my property, which I had graded, graveled, and maintained entirely at my own expense, constituted a historic pedestrian and vehicle corridor that the HOA now had the right to designate as a shared easement. There were 3 spectacular problems with this. First, the drive didn't exist until 2014, which is not historic by any definition I'm aware of. Second, the original HOA covenants contained a specific clause, buried in Appendix C, Section 4, Paragraph 7, which I will be quoting from memory from this point forward, stating that no easement over private property could be created without the written, notarized consent of the affected property owner. Third, my property was zoned as a residential lot with a permitted commercial accessory structure, which put any dispute over that structure's access under county commercial zoning ordinance jurisdiction, not HOA authority. Rosalind read the resolution and made a sound I can only describe as a quiet, satisfied exhale. The sound of an attorney who has just been handed the easiest case of their quarter. But here's the thing. Even with a bad resolution, Beverly had a car in my workshop and a replaced lock on my gate. The law was on my side, but the Lexus was still on my floor. And the county sheriff's deputy who responded to my call that evening was the kind of man who preferred to let neighbor disputes resolve themselves rather than take enforcement action, a stance he communicated to me in a tone that suggested he'd received a phone call before mine. The deputy suggested I contact the HOA in writing. I thanked him politely. Then I went back inside and started photographing everything. Here's something they don't teach you in school, but every pipe fitter learns on the job. When someone is trying to take something from you, your first job is documentation. Date-stamped photos of the vehicle in my workshop, screenshots of my original gate code records, photographs of the replaced lock with the original packaging still in the trash, which, for reasons I still find deeply satisfying, Beverly had thrown into the communal recycling bin down the street rather than her own garbage, meaning it was legally accessible to anyone who walked past. I retrieved that packaging with a set of tongs and bagged it like an evidence tech. The smell of that workshop in March is something I'll carry the rest of my life. Cold concrete, cutting oil, the faint iron scent of old welds, and underneath all of it, the alien smell of a Lexus interior, that combination of leather conditioner and privilege, sitting where my MIG welder usually lives. I sent Beverly a certified letter the next morning, authored by Rosalind, politely informing her that the resolution was legally void, that the vehicle constituted trespass on commercial use property, and that she had 48 hours to remove it before we filed in county court. I kept my copy of every document. I sent a second copy to the county recorder's office. Beverly's response arrived the following day, not by mail, but by appearance. She came to my front door in that linen blazer, holding a folder, and told me through the screen door that the HOA had the authority to regularize shared community infrastructure, that my workshop was an eyesore impacting community property values, and that if I persisted in threatening legal action against volunteer community leadership, the HOA board would be forced to levy fines against my property. I looked at her for a long moment. The gravel crunched under her heels as she shifted her weight. Then I said, "Rosalind, I have her on the front porch. She just threatened fines in retaliation for filing a legal claim." I was on the phone the whole time. Rosalind had been listening. Beverly's face cycled through 3 distinct expressions. The third one was something I'd classify as recalibration. The moment a person realizes they have made a tactical error and is deciding what to do next. She left without another word. The Lexus stayed in my workshop. That was fine. I was starting to think I didn't want the car moved just yet. While Beverly was playing neighborhood boss, I was quietly building a file that would have made a federal prosecutor proud. Rosalind filed the trespass complaint with the county court and simultaneously submitted a formal challenge to the easement resolution with the county recorder. The challenge cited 3 things: the void consent clause in the HOA covenants, the commercial zoning designation of my accessory structure, and, this is the one that really stings, a state statute called Ohio Revised Code Section 5311.081, which governs planned community associations and explicitly prohibits HOA boards from taking unilateral action that impairs a property owner's legal use of their land without a supermajority vote of all homeowners, not just the board. The HOA had not held a community vote, not even close. Rosalind filed that statute like a card face up on the table. Meanwhile, I'd found something interesting in the county property records. Beverly's corner lot, the big one she was so proud of, had a recorded deed restriction from 2003, placed by the original developer, limiting any structure on that lot to a single-family residential use. That restriction was still active, and Beverly, it emerged, had applied 18 months earlier for a permit to build a second detached structure on her property. A studio, she'd called it, without disclosing the deed restriction to the county permit office. Her permit was pending. She was waiting on approval. Now I understood the full shape of the game. Beverly needed good standing with the HOA and a cooperative relationship with county officials to get that permit approved. If I made noise, legal, public, documented noise, her permit application started looking a lot more complicated. My workshop wasn't just an eyesore to her. It was a rival claim on institutional attention. If county zoning staff were busy processing my commercial use dispute, they were looking harder at her paperwork. And the deed restriction was a landmine sitting in her foundation. I did not immediately detonate it. I filed it in the folder, made a note, and went back to work. Bud Federolf, my neighbor to the north, had been watching all of this with the quiet fury of a man who'd received 4 violation notices in 2 years. 2 for his mailbox, 1 for a flagpole, 1 for a garden border that was apparently 2.3 inches too close to the property line. Bud is 61 years old, spent 30 years as a tool and die machinist, and has the kind of institutional memory about Harrowfield that could fill a filing cabinet. He came over one evening while I was in the driveway and told me that 3 other homeowners had received intimidating letters in the past month, all from Beverly, all relating to trivial infractions, all times suspiciously close to an upcoming HOA board election. Bud also told me something I hadn't known. The HOA's annual budget included a $14,000 line item for community beautification and common area improvements, a budget controlled entirely by the board president. There were no receipts, no audit, no public accounting. I added that to the folder, too. Here's your legal knowledge nugget for the day. Ohio law requires HOAs with annual dues above a certain threshold to provide a financial statement to any homeowner upon written request within 10 days. The technical term is a reserve study and financial disclosure, and if the HOA fails to produce it, they can be compelled by court order. I sent that written request the next morning, certified mail, return receipt requested. 2 days after that, Beverly made her second escalation. She filed a formal HOA complaint against my workshop, citing commercial operation in a residential community as a covenant violation. The complaint included photographs taken through my fence, which meant she'd been standing on the fence berm, and a demand that I cease all business operations immediately or face $250 per day fines. I want to be really precise about the timing here because it matters. Beverly filed that complaint on a Wednesday. On that same Wednesday, a county code enforcement officer named Walt Dempsey showed up at my gate, unannounced, uninvited, and told me he'd received a tip about unpermitted commercial activity on my property. I had every permit. I showed them to Walt on my phone while standing in the gravel drive, the gate still closed between us. The smell of fresh gravel dust was sharp and clean in the cold afternoon air. Walt looked at the permits, looked at my property, looked back at the permits and said, with the energy of a man who very much did not want to be there, "Looks like you're all in order." He left. I photographed his truck as it drove away and noted the time. Beverly had friends in the code enforcement office. That was new information. I put it in the folder. The HOA board meeting in April was held in the rec center of Harrowfield's amenity building, a beige carpeted room that smelled of stale coffee and decades of bureaucratic resignation. Folding chairs, fluorescent lights, a folding table at the front where Beverly sat like she was presiding over a Senate hearing. I brought Rosalind. I also brought Bud and our neighbor Gloria Tews and a retired school teacher named Harlan Boggs, who'd lived in Harrowfield since 2004 and had a memory like a steel trap and an absolute burning hatred of injustice that had only intensified in his 70 years on Earth. Beverly called the meeting to order with the quiet confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged in her own living room. She ran through the agenda items with practiced efficiency: landscaping schedules, pool opening dates, an update on the beautification fund. Then she reached agenda item 6, accessory structure commercial use violations, property at 14 Cobblestone Crossing. She said my address the way a prosecutor reads an indictment. I raised my hand. Rosalind stood up beside me and identified herself as counsel for the property owner, and formally notified the board that any punitive action taken against my property pursuant to the void easement resolution or the commercially operating complaint would constitute retaliatory enforcement prohibited under Ohio Revised Code and would be met with a civil suit against the HOA, the board president in her individual capacity, and Clifford Ainsley in his individual capacity. Clifford Ainsley went a particular shade of gray that I found aesthetically satisfying. Then Rosalind handed each board member a copy of the financial disclosure demand letter and formally requested on the record that the board explain the disposition of the $14,000 beautification fund. The room went quiet enough that you could hear the fluorescent lights humming. Beverly said the financial matters were not on the agenda for this evening. Rosalind said that was fine, and that the 10-day statutory response window had begun the day the certified letter was received, and that we would look forward to receiving the documentation. I said nothing. I sat with my hands folded and watched Beverly recalibrate. She moved to adjourn the meeting early. Harlan Boggs invoked his right as a homeowner to raise new business and spent 4 minutes calmly reading from a list of 12 HOA decisions made in the previous 18 months that he believed had been taken without proper supermajority authorization. He read them slowly from a printed sheet with the unhurried confidence of a man who had spent 30 years teaching AP American history and knew exactly how to hold a room. The meeting ended 15 minutes early. 3 homeowners came up to us in the parking lot afterward, then 2 more. Then a woman named Patrice Dunmore, who had been renting her lot from an out-of-state owner for 6 years, and told us Beverly had threatened her with eviction-related complaints if she didn't support the board's agenda. That was, legally speaking, something very close to extortion. I put Patrice's name in the folder. Now, at some point during all of this, someone had gotten into my workshop a second time. I know the date because of my security camera timestamps, 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I know the access was through the back service door, which had a different lock from the main door, and which I had not yet upgraded. Nothing was taken, but things had been moved. A toolbox was in a slightly different position. A stack of fabrication drawings on my workbench had been rifled through. I don't know what they were looking for. I have a theory. My commercial permits, my business registration, my welding certifications, any document that might reveal a gap, an expired license, a lapse in insurance, something Beverly could use to make the county's interest in my property legitimate rather than manufactured. They didn't find anything because there wasn't anything to find. But the intrusion itself was now on camera, and the camera timestamp corresponded to a gap in Beverly's home security footage, which her system automatically uploaded to a cloud server accessible by the HOA management company, whose login credentials I had obtained, legally, through a separate records request, and which I had used for nothing other than to note that the footage gap existed and log the timestamp in my notes. I updated the folder. I changed the lock on the service door, and then I had a long phone call with Rosalind, who told me something that changed everything. She'd pulled the county records on Beverly's pending permit application, and buried in the submittal documents was an attached survey. And the survey showed that Beverly's proposed studio structure was going to encroach by approximately 4 feet onto a recorded drainage easement belonging to the county. The permit was doomed. Beverly just didn't know it yet, but I did. And I started to think about timing. Here's where the story turns. Rosalind called me on a Friday afternoon while I was running welds on a custom bracket order in the shop. The smell of flux and hot metal was thick in the air, the satisfying crackle of the arc, a kind of white noise I've worked in for 25 years. I pulled my helmet up when I saw her number. She'd found the clause. Not just any clause, the clause. The one that, in retrospect, explained everything about why Beverly had targeted my property specifically, and why she'd escalated so aggressively once I pushed back. Here's what Rosalind found. Buried in the original developer's covenant documents from 2002, documents that predated the HOA's current bylaws and legally superseded them in any conflict, was a provision called the Accessory Structure Revenue Share Clause. It was a vestige of the original developer's financing agreement, apparently never removed from the recorded covenants, and it read, in relevant part, that any property in Harrowfield Estates operating a permitted commercial accessory structure, generating revenue in excess of $50,000 annually, was subject to a 2% annual HOA assessment surcharge on net revenue, but only if the HOA board had formally registered a claim under the clause within the first 24 months of the commercial operations county permit issuance. My commercial permit had been issued in 2018. It was now 2023. The 24-month window had expired 5 years ago, making the clause permanently unenforceable against my property. But here's what Rosalind suspected, and what the paper trail began to confirm, is that Beverly had discovered this clause when she reviewed the original covenant documents after taking over as HOA president, and had misread the expiration provision. She believed the clause was still active. She believed she had the legal right to compel me to pay a percentage of my business revenue into the HOA fund, and that if she could establish the easement, establish the commercial use violation threat as leverage, and get me to negotiate a settlement rather than fight her in court, she could lock in that revenue stream before consulting a real attorney and discovering she was wrong. The $14,000 beautification fund with no receipts, that was the warm-up act. She was looking at my welding business, which grossed over $180,000 in its last full year, as a personal revenue source. This wasn't just an HOA power trip. This was fraud. Attempted, yes. Partially concealed, yes. But fraud. Rosalind was careful. "We can't call it fraud until we can show intent and knowledge," she told me. "But what we have right now is enough to bury every single action she's taken in the last 6 months. The easement is void. The commercial use complaint is retaliatory and legally baseless. The financial disclosure non-compliance is a separate statutory violation. And if she tries to enforce that revenue clause, which she can't, but if she tries, she's going to need an attorney who will immediately tell her she has no case. And that attorney is going to ask her some very uncomfortable questions about why she's been running this whole operation." I sat on the shop floor for a moment, helmet in my lap, the smell of cooling steel around me. Then I told Rosalind I needed about 3 weeks. She asked what for. I told her I needed time to set the table. Here is where a lesser man goes to the internet and complains. That's not what happened. I spent the first week doing 3 things in parallel. Building the legal file to Rosalind's specifications, reaching out to my community of affected neighbors, and engineering what I will call, and I want to be precise here, a lawful, property owner authorized, structurally sound physical deterrent. The legal strategy first, because this is the part you can actually use. Rosalind filed what's called a quiet title action against the HOA, challenging the recorded easement as void, and seeking a court declaration that my private drive was my private drive, full stop. In Ohio, a quiet title action is a civil suit filed in common pleas court, and once it's filed, any adverse action against the disputed property, including HOA fines, can be stayed pending resolution. Think of it as hitting pause on the entire HOA enforcement mechanism while the court decides who's right. The HOA had to respond within 28 days, or default. Their liability insurance carrier, who they were required to notify immediately, would have their own attorneys review the case, and those attorneys would not like what they saw. That's the first legal trick: quiet title action as a freeze on HOA enforcement. The second trick was the financial disclosure demand. When the HOA failed to produce the reserve study and financial statements within the 10-day statutory window, Rosalind filed a motion to compel in county court. This forced the HOA to either produce the documents, which would reveal the $14,000 fund irregularities, or face contempt. They produced partial documents on day 14, which meant they were already in technical violation. Rosalind noted it in the record and kept moving. The third trick was the zoning reclassification inquiry. I formally requested in writing that the county zoning office review whether my property's commercial accessory designation meant that HOA authority over my workshop was legally preempted by county zoning law. The county's response, which came back in 8 days, was essentially, yes, for a permitted commercial use structure, county zoning code governs. The HOA's authority was limited to residential use covenant compliance, and my workshop's commercial use was grandfathered and permitted. Rosalind attached this to the quiet title filing like a cherry on top. Now, the physical component. The Lexus was still in my workshop. Beverly had not moved it. I believe she thought that leaving it there preserved some claim, some physical presence that validated her resolution. She was wrong about that legally, but she was right that it complicated a simple tow. Because the moment I towed it, she could argue I'd interfered with HOA property, and while she'd ultimately lose, it would create noise and delay. So instead of towing it, I did something that was completely within my rights as a property owner, completely consistent with my licensed trade, and completely irreversible without heavy equipment. I framed it in. Working at night, over 2 weekends, I welded a steel frame around the interior of the main workshop door, not blocking the car itself, not damaging it, not touching it in any way, but installing a structural reinforcement to the door frame that rendered the main doors non-operable from the outside without a cutting torch. I documented every inch of work with time-stamped photos. I pulled the relevant building permit for the modification. The structure was sound, legal, and entirely within my authority as the property owner, undertaking improvements to his own building. The car was not damaged. The car was not blocked. The car was simply present in a building whose door configuration had been modified in a manner that made rolling it out somewhat more complicated than rolling it in had been. I also installed 4 new security cameras with 24-hour cloud backup, upgraded both door locks to commercial-grade deadbolts, and added a motion-activated exterior light array that would illuminate the gravel drive like a stadium at any hour of the night. Clyde helped with the camera runs. Bud brought food both nights. His wife makes a smoked sausage and potato soup that I would genuinely trade small legal victories for. Harlan Boggs showed up on the second Saturday with a thermos of coffee and spent 4 hours helping me organize and scan every document in the legal file. Gloria Tews drafted a community letter signed by 9 homeowners, requesting an emergency HOA membership meeting to review board governance. By the end of the second weekend, the file was complete. The welds were solid. The plane tickets were purchased. Darlene had packed her bag and was smiling for the first time in 6 months. I left Rosalind with power of attorney for any court appearances during the following 2 weeks, loaded a weather-sealed copy of the complete legal file in the court's e-filing system, and drove to the airport. I posted one photo to the neighborhood Facebook group before boarding. It was a picture of my workshop's exterior, welded door clearly visible, taken in the golden hour light of early evening, with the caption, "Workshop upgrades complete. I'll be back in 2 weeks. Don't touch my stuff." I put my phone in airplane mode. The plane lifted off. I ordered a drink. I want to say Hawaii was entirely peaceful. It was mostly peaceful. My phone, when I turned it back on at designated intervals, was a carnival. Beverly's first move, within 36 hours of my post, was to call an emergency board meeting and vote to begin fining me $250 per day for unauthorized structural modification to an accessory structure, the welded door frame. This was an interesting choice because, first, I had a permit for the modification. Second, the quiet title action had placed a stay on adverse enforcement actions pending court review. And third, By characterizing the door modification as an HOA violation, Beverly had officially acknowledged that the car was inside the structure, which meant she'd officially acknowledged that a vehicle she was associated with was parked in my locked, privately owned, commercially designated workshop. Rosalind received the violation notice, replied with a 3-paragraph letter citing the court stay, and forwarded copies to the HOA's insurance carrier with a note that the board was taking enforcement action in violation of an active court proceeding. The HOA's insurance carrier called Beverly the same day. I know this because Clifford Ainsley, whose nerve had been deteriorating steadily since the April board meeting, called Bud from his personal cell phone and told him, in what I can only describe as a loyalty breaking under pressure, that the carrier's attorney had told Beverly she needed to cease all enforcement activity against my property immediately, and that if she did not, the carrier would consider withdrawing coverage. Clifford also told Bud something else, that Beverly had used $6,400 from the beautification fund to pay a private attorney, one not affiliated with the HOA's insurance-provided counsel, to draft additional enforcement documents against my property. This was a misappropriation of HOA funds for a personal legal dispute. Clifford had signed the check authorizing the expenditure and was, as of the phone call, in a state of what I would characterize as preemptive regret. Bud recorded the call. He had Clifford's consent to do so. He'd asked at the start, and Clifford had said yes, perhaps not fully processing the implications. Back in Hawaii, I was snorkeling above a coral reef when Darlene tapped me on the shoulder and pointed to a hawksbill turtle drifting past about 8 feet below us. We watched it for a long time. The reef smelled like salt and alive things, and nothing that had anything to do with Harrowfield Estates, Ohio. When I checked my messages that evening, there were 47. I read Rosalind's summary, forwarded Bud's recording note to her secure file share, and went to bed. Beverly's second escalation came in week 2. She filed a complaint with the Ohio Department of Commerce's Industrial Commission, alleging that my welding business was operating without proper licensure, a claim that was factually incorrect and demonstrably so within approximately 4 minutes of records review, but which required me to respond formally within 15 days or face an automatic investigation flag. This is a tactic called administrative harassment, filing regulatory complaints not because they have merit, but because responding to them costs the target time and money, and occasionally creates paperwork errors that can be weaponized later. I had anticipated this. Rosalind had a response package already prepared. It was filed within 24 hours, with full documentation, and included a cover letter noting that this was the second instance of Beverly directing regulatory attention toward my property in coordination with code enforcement contacts, and that we were reserving the right to pursue a malicious prosecution claim if the pattern continued. Meanwhile, the county recorder's office had completed its review of the easement challenge. Their preliminary finding, not yet formally issued but communicated to Rosalind informally, was that the resolution was defective on its face and the easement recording would be vacated. And Beverly's permit application? The county's drainage easement review had flagged the encroachment. A hold had been placed on the application pending a survey amendment, which, given the geometry of her lot, was essentially impossible without redesigning the entire structure. She didn't know I'd found that yet. She was still fighting on 3 fronts, burning money and credibility, and I was on a beach watching the sun go down over the Pacific with a cold drink in my hand and a phone full of good news. Here's the thing about people who use systems as weapons. They're very good at attacking people who don't know the systems as well as they do. The moment you know the systems better, the moment you've read every covenant clause, filed every counter document, and made every phone call, they don't have a weapon anymore. They just have a personality problem. And personality problems don't win in court. I landed back in Columbus on a Tuesday night. Darlene was still glowing from the trip. She'd gotten sun on her face for the first time in 2 years, and it looked good on her. I dropped our bags at home, walked out to the workshop in the dark, crunched across the gravel, and stood at the welded door with a flashlight. The Lexus was still there. Of course it was, but someone had tried to move it. There were fresh scrape marks on the concrete floor near the rear tires. Someone had attempted to roll the car back toward the main door, probably to see if there was clearance. There wasn't. The door frame modification had been designed with exactly 12 inches of clearance from the car's front bumper, well within safe parameters, but making any standard vehicle exit path impossible without disassembling the frame. I photographed the scrape marks. I downloaded the security camera footage, 4 cameras, continuous, cloud-backed, and found a timestamp from the previous Saturday at 2:14 a.m., showing 2 individuals in dark clothing and hats, using a Slim Jim tool on the side door, and spending 40 minutes inside the workshop before leaving without the car. The footage was too dark to confirm identities, but one of the individuals had a very distinctive way of walking. A slight lean to the right, left shoulder slightly higher than the right, the kind of gait imbalance that comes from a chronic hip issue. I'd watched Beverly Drummond walk across parking lots enough times that I recognized the pattern. I uploaded the footage to Rosalind's secure server and called her from the driveway. The gravel was wet from overnight rain, and the air smelled cold and clean, and like autumn was finally making up its mind. Rosalind told me the court date for the quiet title action was scheduled for the following Thursday. She also told me that Clifford Ainsley had retained his own attorney, separate from Beverly's, and that his attorney had reached out to hers to discuss cooperating with the property owner's claims in exchange for limited liability consideration. In other words, Clifford was preparing to flip. The community letter drafted by Gloria Tews had gathered 21 signatures and had been formally submitted to the county's planned community ombudsman office, a state office created specifically to investigate HOA governance complaints. The ombudsman had opened a preliminary inquiry. Beverly had received notice of the inquiry by certified mail and had not responded within the required 15-day window. Tamsin Voyle, the board member who'd signed the easement resolution, believing it was a landscaping amendment, had provided a written affidavit to Rosalind's office, stating that she had been misled about the nature of the document she signed, and that she had never consented to any action affecting a private homeowner's property access. Patrice Dunmore had submitted a formal witness statement about the implied threats she'd received regarding her lease and HOA reporting obligations. Beverly, at this point, had been abandoned by her insurance counsel, was being billed by a private attorney she'd paid for with HOA funds, was under ombudsman inquiry, was facing a quiet title action she couldn't win, and had a car she couldn't extract sitting in my workshop like the world's most expensive reminder of overreach. She made one final move in the week before the court date. She went to the local paper, the Harrowfield Courier-Dispatch, which publishes twice a week and has a circulation of about 4,000, and gave them a story. She framed it as a neighborhood dispute over rogue commercial operators in residential communities, and positioned herself as a community advocate protecting property values. The story ran on a Wednesday, above the fold, with a photo of her standing in front of the HOA sign looking purposeful. She did not know that the reporter who wrote the story, a young woman named Cassidy Bellamy, who covered local government and had been tracking the ombudsman inquiry, had already requested all of the public court filings from the quiet title action and financial disclosure proceeding. Cassidy called me the same day the story ran. She asked if I'd be willing to provide comment and documentation for a follow-up piece. I told her I'd be delighted. I gave her the full file. I gave her Bud's recording. I gave her the security camera footage. I gave her a copy of the covenant clause, the void easement, the financial disclosure non-compliance, and the county's preliminary easement challenge finding. Cassidy is a good reporter. She spent 4 days verifying everything independently. Her follow-up ran the following Tuesday, the day before the court date, and it ran with a headline that I will remember until I die. HOA president used community fund to fight private legal battle, records show. The county common pleas courtroom on that Thursday morning was fuller than anyone expected for a quiet title action. Court proceedings like this are usually attended by the attorneys, the parties, maybe a handful of interested neighbors. This one had 23 homeowners from Harrowfield Estates, a representative from the county ombudsman office, Cassidy Bellamy with a notepad, and, because the Courier-Dispatch story had been picked up by the Columbus Metro desk, a reporter from the Dispatch with a camera bag. Clifford Ainsley was there. He sat on the opposite side of the gallery from Beverly, with his own attorney, and did not make eye contact with anyone. Rosalind had prepared for about 20 minutes of oral argument. She got approximately 7. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named the Honorable Patricia Gale, who had been presiding over Franklin County Common Pleas matters for 16 years, and had the demeanor of someone who had permanently run out of patience for preventable problems, reviewed the filing, looked at the HOA's non-appearance. Their insurance counsel had formally withdrawn. Their private attorney had sent a letter requesting a continuance that Judge Gale denied, and began asking questions. The questions were not friendly. By the 9th question, it was clear that Judge Gale had read every document in the filing and had formed opinions about them. She asked the HOA's remaining representative, a nervous young paralegal sent by the private attorney to request the continuance in person, whether the HOA had any evidence that the easement resolution had been submitted to a homeowner's supermajority vote as required by state statute. The paralegal said he wasn't authorized to speak to the merits of the case. Judge Gale said that was unfortunate because she was going to rule on them anyway. She vacated the easement recording. She declared my private drive exclusively private. She issued an injunction prohibiting the HOA from taking any enforcement action against my property, pending a full governance review. She referred the financial disclosure non-compliance to the county attorney's office for civil investigation, and she noted, on the record, that the board's pattern of conduct, documented in the filing, was consistent with retaliatory enforcement prohibited under state statute, the specific provisions of which I need not enumerate here, as counsel for the property owner has done so exhaustively. Rosalind allowed herself a very small smile. Now, the workshop. After court, I drove back to the shop with Bud, Clyde, and Harlan, and a mobile welding rig on Clyde's trailer. We used a cutting torch to remove the welded door frame reinforcement, a process that took about 40 minutes and filled the driveway with the sharp, clean smell of hot steel and the satisfying sound of metal separating cleanly. And then, Clyde hooked the Lexus to a flatbed tow truck he'd arranged. I had contacted Beverly's attorney that morning with formal notice that the vehicle would be removed from my property at 2 p.m., pursuant to the court's injunction and pursuant to Ohio tow and storage law, and that storage and removal fees had been accumulating at the commercial rate since the day of first trespass. The Lexus was towed to a licensed storage facility. The fee invoice, calculated at commercial storage rates for the weeks the car had been present, totaled $3,847. Under Ohio law, when a vehicle is towed from private property for unauthorized parking, the vehicle owner is liable for all towing and storage fees before the vehicle can be released. Beverly could pay the bill and get her car, or she could dispute it in court and face the judge who had just ruled against her on every single point. She paid the bill. Her attorney confirmed this to Rosalind the following morning, in a tone that suggested the attorney was also billing her for the call and looking forward to the end of the engagement. The moment the tow truck cleared my driveway, Bud opened a cooler he'd had waiting in his truck and handed out cold drinks to everyone present. Gloria Tews had brought a sheet cake. Harlan had brought lawn chairs. Patrice Dunmore came over from down the street. Even Tamsin Voyle showed up, still embarrassed but present, and that matters. We stood in the gravel driveway in the afternoon light, the workshop doors wide open behind us, the smell of fall air mixing with the last warm breath of the season, and somebody made a toast. I don't remember the exact words. I remember the sound of it, the particular quality of laughter that only happens when a group of people who have been holding their breath for a long time finally breathe out. Cassidy Bellamy photographed the cake. It ran in the paper. The caption said, "Neighbors gather to celebrate court ruling in Harrowfield property dispute." Here's what happened to everyone in the months that followed. Beverly Drummond resigned from the HOA board 2 weeks after the court ruling, in a letter that described her departure as a personal decision to pursue other community interests, a sentence that performed remarkable emotional labor given the circumstances. The county attorney's civil investigation into the beautification fund irregularities is ongoing as of this telling. Her permit application was formally denied 6 weeks later due to the drainage easement encroachment, and she has not filed a new application. Clifford Ainsley cooperated fully with the Ombudsman inquiry. His written statement confirmed that Beverly had directed the $6,400 expenditure from the community fund over his documented objection and had threatened to implicate him in other irregularities if he refused to sign the check. He was issued a formal reprimand and required to complete a fiduciary responsibility course. He's still on the board, now under new leadership, and by Bud's account, has become notably enthusiastic about proper documentation. Tamsin Voyle was cleared of any knowing wrongdoing by the Ombudsman inquiry. She is now the board's recording secretary and has instituted a policy requiring all members to receive a plain English summary of any document before signing it, a small but meaningful improvement. Bud Federolf ran for the HOA board in the following spring election, unopposed, and won. His first act was to commission a full audit of the previous 2 years' finances, hire an HOA management company to handle administrative functions, and reduce the HOA dues by $120 annually once the financial irregularities were rectified and properly accounted for. Patrice Dunmore was able to convert her long-term rental agreement into a full purchase with assistance from a first-time buyer program she hadn't previously known existed. Harlan Boggs helped her navigate the paperwork. He will deny enjoying this, but he was grinning when I saw him leave her house the day the purchase closed. My business had its best year in 2023. Part of that was good contract work. Part of it was that the legal process had forced me to get every piece of documentation in perfect order. Permits, registrations, insurance, certifications. And having everything airtight made bidding on larger municipal and commercial contracts significantly easier. The lesson there is not subtle. Paperwork you do reluctantly to defend yourself often becomes the foundation of something bigger. Rosalind Fitch, if you're ever in Central Ohio and need a property attorney who reads HOA covenants like crime fiction and fights like someone personally offended by bad faith, I'll give you her number. And the Harrowfield Estates community, I want to end here, because this is the part that actually matters most. Gloria Tews, who started this whole community organizing effort with a letter and her own kitchen table, proposed using the $6,400 that was eventually recovered from the beautification fund, plus matching contributions from 14 neighbors, to establish the Harrowfield Estates Dale Pruitt Trade Skills Scholarship, named for my father, awarded annually to a graduating senior from our local high school who is pursuing a career in the skilled trades, welding, pipe fitting, electrical, HVAC, carpentry, any of it. The first scholarship was awarded last spring to a kid named Bennett who was enrolled in a welding certification program at the community college. He came to the neighborhood summer cookout to say thank you. He shook my hand and looked me in the eye, and I thought about my father dropping that come-along chain on the workshop floor, and the two of us laughing until we hurt. That building got used for something good after all.